Allen Boyer was born in Lebanon, Pennsylvania on May 25, 1950. Mr. Boyer was a product of Elwood and Dolores Boyer, who raised him in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, along with 4 other kids. His father worked at several locations around Reading, Pennsylvania, starting out in the textile knitting mills, but ended up working in northern Rockwell on various space projects. He retired in 1987 with 42 years in the working environment. Mr. Boyer's mother worked in the Richland knitting mills in Richland, retiring in 1982. Mr. Boyer has 2 brothers and has twin sisters. His younger brother Michael, who is 12 years younger than Mr. Boyer, making him 56. Madeline and Marilyn are his twin sisters. As a young boy, Mr. Boyer was fascinated with submarines.
And I used to get a lot of flack at school, I guess you could call it, because I was going to go on a boat that sank.
Back when Mr. Boyer was a sophomore, he already had it in mind that he would enlist before he was drafted. Mr. Boyer's older brother came back from Vietnam. His parents were worried that he would be drafted. His mother was pleased to hear that Mr. Boyer had enlisted into the submarine force. There were certain things that he had to complete, such as tests. They had 120 trainees in the steel tube, and they had dropped the pressure. Some of the trainees would crack under pressure, and the pressure would be released. It took some time to release the pressure, but the trainees that couldn't handle the pressure were sent home. After the tests had finished, only 37 of the 120 trainees had passed the claustrophobia tests. Mr. Boyer was the first group to go through the claustrophobia testing. The first group that tested started at 7 o'clock or 7:30 in the morning. During the pressurizing and the claustrophobia tests, it usually lasted for 5.5 hours. They had to spend 5 to 8 minutes at 150 feet of pressure per square inch. Then once the light had turned off, the pressure was decompressing. Mr. Boyer was one of the guys that passed and was heading into the fleet. There was also life lessons that Mr. Boyer and the other guys had learned while in the service. There were multiple incidents where Mr. Boyer experienced a life lesson. TAC stands for Teach, Administer, and Challenge. When the candidates answered the questions by the TAC officer, they had to start their response with the word sir, then answer the question and end in the word sir.
I was the first person to stand in front of my TAC officers to get out of the dining facility. You had to answer a question. And you had to answer the question in a certain regiment. Like the TAC officer Miller asked me, and I remember this to this day, Candidate Boyer, did you watch TV last night? And you had to say, sir, no, sir. Start with sir, answer the question, end in sir. I said, sir, no, sir. He said, so you didn't watch the Philadelphia Phillies and the Chicago Cubs play baseball? I said, sir, no, sir. Now I want you to think about this. He said, okay, here's your question. Who played third base for the Chicago Cubs in the 3rd inning? How was I supposed to know? I said, sir, I have no idea. Outside, beat your face, which meant you went outside and did calisthenics. My whole class did that. Now, how are we supposed to know that? Think about that for a minute. We had no idea. Do you know where I'm going with this? This will give you a really good wake-up call. This same guy came out. He was my TAC officer. And Mr. Miller yelled, where's Candidate Boyer? Put my hand up. Come here. So I walked over. He said, okay. He said, what did I ask you? He said, you asked me who played third base in the 3rd inning for the Chicago Cubs. Now think about that for a minute. I gave the answer. I had no clue what he was talking about. He said, Boyer, the 3rd baseman played third base in the 3rd inning for the Chicago Cubs. I went, oh my God. I mean, you think about that, that really made me change my whole thinking process, because your mind goes automatically to the toughest answer. He gave me the answer in the request.
Not paying attention to the simplest directions could cost people precious time. Many other of the candidates there had learned other life lessons, but most of the life lessons may have been common. While Mr. Boyer was in the submarines, whenever they had free time, they would have to entertain themselves.
In their free time, they tried to play as many movies as they could. One of the movies that was everyone's favorite was called Run Silent, Run Deep. The movie was based on a true story. Another way that they would entertain themselves was playing a card game called Pinochle. To be able to have free time on their patrols, they had to find out how long the patrols would last. They also had to worry about the noises that they made in the submarines. Everything in the submarines was either carpeted or rubber matted. Even in the engine room, there was rubber-coated flooring. Even while watching movies or entertaining themselves, they had to have their sonar on passive. While on passive sonar, they just listened for other submarines. While on active sonar, the submarine sends out a ping when they're trying to find something. Most of the time, the submarines were always on passive sonar because then the submarine wouldn't give its location away. After Mr. Boyer finished his service, he had to readjust to civilian life. After coming home from service, they didn't have a routine like they had in the submarines. The worst thing they could do was miss movement. Miss movement means that they are not aboard the ship or boat when it departed. If they were missed movement, they had to find their own way to port. Then they would have to face the captain's punishment for missed movement. When returning home, it wasn't ideal to be in uniform. There was people protesting the war, and it just wasn't a good idea to wear a uniform. Most of the guys had worn their uniform because they were drafted. Mr. Boyer's reasons was because he didn't want to be drafted. One of the instances that had happened was that one guy decided to spit on a Marine's uniform. There were many police officers involved. Mr. Boyer had been separated from the USS Bluefish and went to NES Navy Air Station in Norfolk. At the NES Navy Air Station in Norfolk, they had many people in a holding company so they were able to process their orders. Dealing with the protests after returning home was worth receiving the medals that Mr. Boyer earned. Mr. Boyer's medals and awards that he is most proud of is the Legion of Merit and the Dolphins he earned. Mr. Boyer received the Dolphins on a Friday for the USS Bluefish. Mr. Boyer was approached by Admiral Rickover, which Admiral Rickover had Mr. Boyer take the Dolphins off his uniform. Mr. Boyer had a 4-star admiral personally pin the Dolphins to his uniform. He has cherished them ever since. Mr. Boyer received the Legion of Merit for being in service for almost 30 years. One of his most treasured medals he achieved, his Legion of Merit medal, which he described was quite difficult because of his technical work.
Well, we thank you for coming here, Alan. This is a huge honor for us to interview you, and we want to thank you for your service as well.